So Vicky, now that we've talked a little bit about the competency model and the application process and how to prepare, perhaps we could talk a little bit about the interview process itself. And perhaps we could start with you telling us exactly what does a competency-based interview mean?
The good news is you've been invited to the interview, you're a candidate. That means the competencies that were in your application in terms of your skills and your knowledge and your key achievements are known by the committee. They want to use the interview process as an opportunity to assess behavioral competencies. For many posts, in addition, there could be a presentation for technical purposes, and there could be follow-up questions about that. There could be some other technical questions. There could be other questions, and we'll come to that later. But right now, to focus on competency-based questions, it's on the behavioral competencies that are put in the vacancy notice. It can only be those competencies. Sometimes you have 3 of those questions out of the 5 competencies. It really depends on the position. So it gives the committee an opportunity to ask questions, to give them as much evidence as they can get to make an objective assessment of whether each candidate, and remember it's up to 5 candidates, whether they have the competencies required for that position. They use at WHO we use a 5-point scale where 3 is acceptable. Acceptable in terms of the candidate profile. 4 is more than acceptable, 5 superior. So the questions, being competency-based, are not hypothetical like, what do you think are good elements of teamwork? Well, good teamwork is about blah, blah, blah. The assumption is, with competency-based, that it's something you've done in the past that's illustrated your ability to overcome a particular difficult situation that demonstrates those competencies. So a competency-based question will always be phrased in the past tense, like, tell us a time when you had to communicate to a hostile audience, or tell us about a situation when you had to produce results and there was an extremely tight deadline. Those are the kinds of questions that would be competency-based in order for the selection committee to make their assessment.
Thank you. So when it comes to the interview itself, what exactly can the candidate expect?
The candidate will be welcomed by the chair of the selection committee. Each member of the panel will introduce themselves. The chair will explain the process and say how many competency-based questions there are, and if there's a presentation about that. Explain the process, explain the role of the committee in terms of being advisory to the regional director, and the length of time one can expect to have a result. And then to move forward to the competency-based questions, a member of the panel will ask, tell us about a time when. Now, there's a difference between ideal and real. In terms of learning, we talk about the ideal interviewer in competency-based. The ideal interviewer is there not only to ask the initial question, but to ask follow-up questions in order to ensure that they understand the situation, that they understand the actions that that person took, and they understand the results of those actions. The ideal interviewer is encouraging, allows for the person to digest the information, maybe a little bit of silence while the person's processing. Sometimes, however, you don't have that ideal interviewer, and you need to be prepared for the less than ideal situation where you need to supply all that information. And that's where you need to be prepared with this SAR framework in terms of situation, action, and results.
If you're using examples to best demonstrate the behaviors that you have used in the past, what would you suggest if you don't have an example that fits the question?
Yeah, that often comes up. in fact, when people look at some of the standard questions, they get more nervous about the interview than they should do, because they say, I don't have a situation where I resolved conflict, or I don't have a situation where I had a hostile audience. How can I possibly answer that question if I don't have the situation? The committee has been in situations, or I've been on selection committees, where the candidate doesn't have an example. So there's different ways to tackle that. If you don't have an example, go on to another question, or you've prepared and you have examples of, for example, communication, but you don't have one that fits that particular question. So you can ask the committee, well, I have this other example, a little bit about what it is about. Can I tell that story? And the committee might say yes, might say no. Or you also need to think about the word like conflict in a broader context. It's not just about, a fist-out fight between that kind of conflict, but a disagreement, something you aren't quite happy about, and use that as an example. Say, I don't have an example of a conflict. I do have an example where I disagreed with a team member, and this is how I dealt with that particular situation.
So in terms of the interview, we've heard about the SAR framework and perhaps some of the problems with interviewers and not having the right examples or not having understood the competencies correctly. It sounds like preparation is key. So how can a candidate best prepare for a competency-based interview?
There's the long version, several pages, or going to the internet and looking at everything to know about competencies, or there's the short version, which is one sheet of paper that explains that you need to study the vacancy notice. First, you need to print out the vacancy notice. You need to read it more than once. You need to understand the candidate profile. What are they looking at in terms of knowledge, skill, and behavioral competencies? Then you need to list all the competencies of the ideal candidate, not only the ones that are listed under the section called competencies, but all the competencies that you see in the duties and responsibilities. There could be competencies also under functional skills. I've seen cases where they talk about ability to network. Well, that's a behavioral competency. Ability to problem solve, that's also a competency. So you need to look at the totality of those competencies and list them. Then you need to think about your own history and what experiences you have that you think demonstrate that you possess these competencies. And then you need to use this SAR, Situation Action Results framework, to describe that experience. Very often in an interview, you have maybe 5 minutes to respond. 5 minutes for some people seem like a lot of time, and for other people, not a lot of time. It's not a good idea to just go on and on. You need to be very focused, and that's where the preparation comes in. If you have 5 minutes, you should think about you have 1 minute to explain the situation, who is involved, some of the facts, the figures. For example, we had someone who dealt with procurement. There's a big difference between saying I was responsible for procuring goods and services, and I was responsible for managing procurement for $4.5 million in order to support whatever program it might be. So those kinds of facts and figures are extremely important in giving the committee an idea of what was the situation, what were the challenges involved in that particular situation, and what was your task. Then you need to think about the actions that you took. And yes, you can say, I was part of a team, we were responsible for this was our mission. But then you need to go to I did this was my particular role, this was my responsibility. And maybe think about 2 minutes to make your actions clear. And then you need some time, another 2 minutes perhaps, to talk about the outcome of the results. Based on your actions or based on the actions of the team, what was the outcome? So that the committee gets the flow, the whole story from beginning to end. There might not have been a positive outcome. That gives you an opportunity to talk about lessons learned. That's also a good thing to communicate to the committee.
Do you think it's a good idea to practice before going to an interview?
I think that's an excellent idea. I think practicing is good. I personally hate to rehearse, rehearsing in terms of learning lines, but practicing thinking about this framework. What was the situation? What are the facts and figures? What do I need to communicate to the committee? What actions I took? Yes, practice, and practice at least enough examples, 2 or 3 per behavioral competency.
So you said that during the interview, a candidate should try as much as they can to express enthusiasm. We all know that interviews can be very stressful, though. So, what tips can you give us to help the candidate understand and control their nerves?
Yeah, exactly. It's ironic that on the one hand, everybody knows the appropriate body language for an interview, that you have to have eye contact, that you have to appear confident, you have to appear relaxed, you have to be assertive, all these things. In the meantime, you're nervous and you're fidgeting and you're doing all these things that you know you shouldn't be doing, which just increases your nervousness. And it doesn't help knowing that it's going to be a video conference, because you feel you're that much, or some people it might be helpful. There's different opinion about whether you want to be in the room or not in the room. But very often these days, interviews are conducted with video conference, and then it's even more important to maintain eye contact with the committee, to try to engage them, even though you might be thousands of kilometers from each other. So all of that people know, but what do you do to control your nerves? I came across the work of a social psychologist called Amy Cuddy. And her work was interesting because she did research on what she called the power pose. She looked at different cultures and different people. She looked at politicians, she looked at athletes, and she said, what were they doing in terms of body language that indicate that they maintained power? And very often it was this kind of thing. You see, when you look at the Olympics, it's somebody, yes, I made it across. And that's what she called a power pose. And then she took that research and wanted to explore, because her work was also in stimuli and in hormones, what would happen if people under a job, people who were being interviewed for a job, which is very stressful, did the power pose. And first, her hypothesis was that you could get people to a point of actually being faking. So they faked that they were confident enough so that they could manage the interview, or they faked that they were assertive. But in fact, her research showed, because she did all sorts of tests, that when people did this power pose for 2 minutes before going into a job interview, their testosterone level went up, so their feeling of power went up, and their cortisol level went down, so their stress went down. Now, it doesn't last forever, but it lasts enough for people to be themselves, be confident during the interview. And it's been proven to work. It may sound silly, but I know from anecdotal evidence that the power pose really does work. So it's important 2 minutes at least before the interview that you just go somewhere, no matter how silly you might be, to get your power up. Because what she found was very often, typically, people going in an interview do the opposite. They sit in the chairs and they kind of slump. And when you do that, physiologically, your cortisol level goes even higher up. So certain things are happening, obviously, in your body that you want to be able to control. So look at Amy Cuddy's work. That's what I advise.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll see our colleagues practicing their power poses
Yes, exactly.
around the office. Lastly, and briefly, perhaps we could talk about the questions themselves, because not all questions have to be competency-based.
Yeah.
So what other questions could a candidate anticipate in an interview?
Right. Firstly, again, we go back to this rather diffuse definition of competency. So very often competency-based selections, we're focusing on behavioral competencies. But in fact, it's all about competencies in the sense of skills and knowledge. That's the first thing to understand. So there may be some technical questions as well. Very often, an interview will start with a question like, tell us about yourself. That is, I think, a very difficult question because you don't know what they want to know about you. And you should only use about 30 seconds of your time to pinpoint certain things that you want to communicate. It's not your life history. If you start launching on that, your life history, or start repeating everything in your application, it doesn't give a good impression. It's your opportunity to say something about yourself, about your competencies, about your achievements, that you think it's important for the committee to know. And it's slightly different from another type of question you might get, like why do I apply for this? Why did you apply for this position? Now, if you haven't thought about why you've applied, your hesitancy and your inability to respond is obviously noted by the committee. That's not good. If you've done your cover letter for your application, which we advise you to do, then already you've thought about your motivation for this position and what you can contribute. That's what they're looking for in that response. That's what we call your elevator speech. Your elevator speech is if you were on the ground floor of a tall building and you were next to somebody and were to give your elevator speech, what would you say to that person in the 30 seconds you have going up to the top floor? What are the essential things? And you need to prepare for that. There are also, as will be noted by the chair in the beginning, the interview will end with, do you have a question for us? Now, very often people say, no, that's fine. It's okay to say no. It's not a good thing to ask, well, when will I hear the results? Because at the beginning, the chair has already explained that. It's not a good thing to ask about particular things regarding salary or employment conditions. You can get that information from the HR contact person you've had. It is an excellent idea to ask questions you might have about the vacancy notice, about the position that you feel or haven't been clarified. That's the opportunity to ask those kinds of questions. And not only is it okay, it in fact gives a good impression to the committee that you've studied the vacancy notice. You're to the extent that you've looked at it and you've wondered about certain things that you want to ask about.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed.
Mm-hmm.